Hello? Hello? Hi, we are going to start. Thank you very much. Grateful if you could take your seats.
Nunes con Z, ¿cierto?
Sí, Nunes con Z, es que a veces tarda un poquito más. Sí. Ya. Le introduzco. Sí. ¿Empiezo? Pues, yo tengo unas palabras que nos dijeron para leer estándar. ¿Está bien? Ah, perfecto. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests, welcome to the United Nations. We are delighted to have you here today, and thank you for joining us at the Financing for Development Dialogues from Evidence to Action. This event provides a unique opportunity to bring the academic community into the heart of discussions on financing for development. It is a crucial part of our efforts to establish academia as a crucial partner in the global preparatory process leading up to the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which will take place in Spain next year in June. My name is Sara Núñez, and I am Economic Affairs Officer in DESA. We are honored to welcome you, distinguished scholars, to this panel entitled Taxation, Institutions, and Governance. As we have a packed schedule and we are aiming to finish on time, I kindly ask the moderator, Ms. Marta Roig, to be cognizant of the time we have to ensure we allow space for all the panels. To officially begin this session, I would like to introduce Ms. Roig, who is Chief of the Emerging Trends and Issues in the Development section at the Division for Inclusive Social Development in DESA. To start the session, Ms. Roig, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Is it on? Thank you, Sara, and let me join you and welcome you all this morning to this panel on taxation and institutions and governance. Let me make a few introductory remarks very quickly, then I will introduce the panelists. Each panelist will present for about 10 to 12 minutes, and hopefully we will have at least 15 minutes left for discussion at the end, right? So just very broadly to maybe set the stage for the panel. Fiscal policy, fiscal contracts are a very important element of broader social contracts. And we don't have to call them social contracts, we can call them the balance of rights and responsibilities that hold societies together. Fair fiscal contracts are a central part of it. What do I mean by fair fiscal contracts? That would be fiscal contracts that help reduce, basically, in a very simplified way, fiscal contracts that help reduce poverty and inequality now and in the future, meaning that by reducing poverty and inequality now, they cannot jeopardize the ability of the state to continue reducing poverty and inequality in the future. We are right now preparing the World Social Report that will come out next year in 2025, in the first quarter in 2025. We are looking at issues related to the social contract and to fair fiscal contracts in the report. And what we are basically saying is that the benefits of fair fiscal contracts don't stop just at the economic. It's not only about the transfers that are made to families, it's not only about the educational and health benefits of these contracts, but that there are broader societal benefits. Fair fiscal contracts strengthen trust in institutions and promote social cohesion. Compliance with, for example, tax regulations is higher when people trust that other people are complying with regulations and when they trust that their governments are making good use of their taxes. So there's basically a fair fiscal contract engages a virtuous cycle that promotes social cohesion and trust in institutions, and the other way around. When there are no fair fiscal contracts in place, when people don't see that they don't receive the necessary public support, insecurity, economic insecurity and inequality increases, people lose trust in institutions, and it becomes harder to establish fair fiscal contracts. So there are virtuous and vicious cycles. in a very stylized, I'm talking very stylized ways. Probably the real picture is much more complex than that. That's the first point. The second point is that next year, in addition to the Financing for Development Conference, member states are holding World Social Summit, as probably some of you know, the second World Summit for Social Development. In preparation for the summit, there has been, at least within the UN system, a lot of talk about social policy. What I would like, and I hope this panel and other panels make clear, is that social policy is necessary to address social challenges, but it's not sufficient. That what we need is what we, in the report we are preparing, we call a social lens to policy making. And that social lens includes fair fiscal contracts, macroeconomic policies that reduce inequality, promote decent work, and et cetera, et cetera. So I hope this will be part of the presentations and the discussion during the panel, what constitutes fair social contracts, how we get there. Without further ado, let me introduce the speakers. I will introduce the first speaker and then pass the floor, and just when the second speaker speaks, I'll introduce them. So the first speaker is Amir Lebdui. Welcome. Amir Lebdui is an associate professor of political economy of development at the University of Oxford. And he's also the director of the Technology and Industrialization Center for Development. Amir, the floor is yours. Once you reach 10 minutes, I'll give you a heads up. 12 minutes, we'll try to cut the presentation. Thanks so much.
Is that the correct?
That's fine.
No, below session WF. Yeah, that one. I'll put a timer. Thank you very much for this panel. Thank you for the moderation. Thank you for the organizers and wider, especially for it's a long program. And it's nice to have this kind of support to then share the findings in these kind of spaces. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Can you sit on the other side, the slides? Cool. This room is very intimidating. It looks like a war room. But anyways, so this is to present the result of a study that I did with Tony Addison on sovereign wealth funds in Africa. And we're really wondering, have they actually achieved their purpose, right? Most of Africa's sovereign wealth funds were created in the 2000s with the beginning of the commodity boom. But what's left of their legacy? And now this is a very timely moment to reassess this, because for the past few years, commodity prices have gone down, but now the prices for mining and metals is rising again, and some countries are wondering whether they should actually pursue again this model. So, a little overview. Actually, no, this, next slide, please. So the picture is actually pretty shocking, because there are about 19 sovereign wealth funds in Africa, right, representing a fifth of total sovereign wealth funds by number in the world, but their capitalization is 0.1% of the world sovereign wealth fund capitalization. And what is even more shocking is that in the last 10 years, the asset capitalization of African sovereign wealth funds has shrank by 67%. 67%, right? So nowadays, it's about $73 billion. But even that is actually misleading, because most of that is basically coming from the Libyan sovereign wealth fund, which is the only large sovereign wealth fund remaining in Africa. But that's because its assets are frozen, right? So it's about, yeah. So if you actually take that off, the picture is even more bleak. And the comparison with national development banks is quite useful, which was not the initial purpose of our work, but then it's kind of the conclusion of thinking what could have been alternative ways. Because development banks in Africa, it's also about a fifth of the world's total in terms of number, but it's less than 1% in terms of capitalization. Next slide, please. So there are three types of sovereign wealth funds. There are stabilization funds, there are development funds, and there are intergenerational funds. Stabilization funds tend to have liquid assets, and the idea is that this is basically a rainy day fund, right? Governments use it so that they can have this pool of money to draw from in case of a shock and to smoothen expenditure. So that's basically a useful instrument to deal with volatility. Development funds have a development mission. They're basically, stabilization fund typically invest in financial assets overseas, right? So low risk, safe assets, but don't really have an impact on domestic development. Development funds tend to invest domestically, right, in productivity enhancing assets. And the idea is that, they can help stimulate, the productive diversification of the economy. And intergenerational funds, the main purpose is basically to ensure that future generations also benefit from the resource. It's based on the premise that the resource in the ground doesn't just belong to the current generation, but also to people, to children, to those that are not yet born, potentially. So this can be done with future liabilities like pension funds. All of those have pros and cons, right? And in Africa, what you see is that most sovereign funds have that stabilization mandate, and some of the funds have an unclear, right? That is the dark gray, is because they actually either mix many of those, or it's actually not clear what are the key objectives of the funds. Next slide. So this I had just mentioned it earlier. Next slide, please. Yeah. So pros and cons. Stabilization funds are very useful because they can help deal with unanticipated external shocks. So on the African continent, this was particularly useful when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, right? Many countries were able to draw from their funds. But the problem is it doesn't really support productive diversification, right? In fact, you're addressing in a country that is highly dependent on fossil fuels, for example, or on any volatile commodity. These kind of funds, what is really useful to remember is they only address the symptoms of the problem, but not the root cause, right? They address the fact that your revenues are volatile, but they don't really address the fact that you're too dependent on the revenue, on that type of revenue stream in the first place. They can have usually low returns. And the main point here that we're saying is this can be really useful if the country doesn't have access to other types of financial reserves, right? So that's a good way to get insured. But you wouldn't need it if you had an international monetary system that provided adequate help when you need it, right? So in many countries, they're actually over-insured. The second one is, so now we're kind of try to compare it with alternative uses. So let me jump to intergenerational funds. So they support, as I mentioned, future generations, but the issue is, they can be high opportunity costs for current generations, right? If the wealth transfer is done basically just through a financial means, but another way to support future generations is to invest now, right? If your children are born in a place where you have lower infant mortality rates or you have better access to education and health, this is one way to actually have intergenerational transfer. Can you go to the next slide, please? And actually what we found is that, it's often the African sovereign wealth funds are compared with, in other ones like the ones in the Gulf or the Norwegian sovereign fund. But, in many of the African countries that have a sovereign wealth fund, even especially with an intergenerational mandate, if you compare it with infant mortality rate, you find that many of them actually keep that money in financial assets, but you have very high rates of infant mortality, right? So how do you justify it? And would it not be a better investment to, invest in prenatal care, right, with that money? It's a better way to actually ensure that the next generation has adequate support. Next slide. Actually, no, can you go back? Previous slide. That's right, thanks. Now, another alternative is actually paying down national debt, right? Many countries on the African continent, as most of you would know, face extremely high cost of external borrowing. So would it not make sense, instead of putting your assets in a sovereign fund in which you get 2 to 3% annual return, would it not make sense to pay down your national debt and then basically be able to borrow at a lower cost? And that can help reduce the current debt service, but there are still the assumptions that capital markets are actually open to African economies in case of a shock, right? And this option is useful if the interest rate on sovereign debt exceeds the return on investments of the sovereign wealth fund. And the last option is the development finance, right? Development funds. So that includes sovereign development funds, but also things like national development banks. 2 minutes, wow. And what we found is that this is particularly important, especially when you need to diversify your productive structures. Many African countries depend on either fossil fuels, where demand is expected to drop, or agro-based products, which are highly vulnerable to climate change. So here, the success depends on containing state failures and having the right type of institutional capabilities to ensure that decisions are made with sufficient transparency and oversight. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, perfect. So perfect. I'm already at the conclusion. So some of the takeaways from our research. So sovereign wealth funds have been a symbol of national success and geopolitical influence. But actually, if you look at their track record over the past 20 years, you see that their impact has been quite limited, and that's precisely because they were addressing a symptom of commodity dependence, but not the root cause. So today, African countries are facing the same situation that they faced in the early 2000s, right? High risks of debt distress, commodity refugees coming in, but they're still highly dependent on the commodities that put them in this situation in the first place. So stabilization has been useful, fiscal stabilization funds, but they had a very high opportunity cost, right? Because they did not allow for this kind of resources to be invested in productive structures. Returns on investment in human capital far exceed those on financial investments overseas. The case for intergenerational savings are generally quite weak, except for middle-income countries with large revenues. On the African continent, we found that Botswana is the only country that could get close to that situation, but for the rest, it's better to invest for current generations. So there's therefore a stronger case for national development banks or sovereign development funds, right, provided that they have a clear mandate. But here, global cooperation is particularly important, right? Because successful experiences of national development banking, there are many lessons to learn from the Brazilian National Development Bank, from what Malaysia has done. And so this kind of peer-to-peer learning on development banking needs to be further strengthened and supported. And lastly, we need to recognize political realities. The objectives of funds tend to change when political realities kick in. So sometimes when around election time, right, the funds becomes basically a source where instead of being an investment fund, you start to draw for other priorities. And that's something to be quite conscious of. And last slide, please. So for further information, we have here 2 papers that I'm putting forward, where the analysis is there with more data and sources and more details on the policy implications. Thank you for your attention.
I realized that, I'm sorry, Kunal, I forgot. Kunal, the organizer of the event, wanted to give some introductory remarks, and I forgot to pass the floor to you. Do you want to do it now?
Maybe I could do it when I speak.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so let's move on then directly to the next presentation, which will be from Marina Nistotskaya. Marina is a professor of political science at the Department of Political Science in the University of Gothenburg, and the former director and researcher of the Quality of Government Institute at the same university. Marina, the floor is yours.
Is that correct? Green. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present our paper, my presentation based on several papers: No Taxation Without Property Rights, Formalization of Property Rights and Taxes on Individuals in Sub-Saharan Africa. Quite a mouthful, but basically our idea is the key question that we are asking: why do people pay taxes? Next slide. And if you think this is a simple question, there is a whole literature on this, the fiscal contract literature. And the main argument that this literature puts forward is that people pay taxes in exchange for political representation and for public goods, for free education or subsidized education, health, and etc. So what we are doing in this paper is, or in particular this paper is we put forward an argument saying that it might be very well be a case that people do this in exchange for a private good and for the formalization of property rights, for having property rights. So there is in the literature, there is a distinction between when resource is a mere possession or a property. So for example, no bank will take your word that you own this piece of land. This is a possession. You need to have property rights. The formalization enables resource owners to participate in a large-scale impersonal economic exchange, unlocking greater economic opportunities. So this is a reference to Douglas North about impersonal exchange, 3 recent Nobel Prize laureates who also talk about impersonal exchange, and we all know that large-scale exchange also leads to better economies, stronger economies. So as a result, when people have this opportunity, their income will grow, and then this income will generate basically consent to pay taxes to the authority that underpins these property rights. And in most of the cases, this authority is state. So what is the instrument of formalization of property rights for the specific resource land? It's a cadastre. Cadastre is a record that contains 3 pieces of information. What? It's a description of land asset. Who? It's the party that holds interests over this asset. And which rights? What are the restrictions, rights, and responsibilities over the land asset? So this is an example of a 3,700 years old cadastre from Babylon. What we don't know about this cadastre, whether it was state or private, right? But you can see, next slide, you can see that there is all 3 elements. There is what, these are elements, the plot of land are properly described. Inside you can see it's the name of the owners, and the lower panel is the opposite side of the same tablet, and it's the description of rights. So what's interesting, we completely as humanity lost this technology for a number of years, and it was only re-emerged in the Roman Empire, and to be honest, in a systematic way, for example, in Europe, it's only from the 1400s that states do cadastres. So this is our data on state-administered cadastres around the globe and by world regions. If you can see, so in Africa there is a really recent increase in cadastrification compared to the other regions. If you look at the data between cadastrification globally and the collection tax revenues, we have a very strong relationship. However, it was interesting to have a look at what is happening in Africa. So in many countries, land rights still remain relational, right? So I know what Amir holds, what Kunal have in terms of possession, but you guys on the other side of the table, you don't know, you cannot prove this, right? If you want to buy land from Kunal, I wouldn't advise you because he has no documents about this, right? State supported. So, and this locks individuals out of opportunities to participate in this big, large-scale, impersonal economic exchange. However, in some countries, state started cadastrification, and one of the examples is Ethiopia. So, for example, you have these books of where it's written who is the owner, what kind of properties, and on the right side you see the cadastral map, which is the description of the property right, of the asset itself. So, unfortunately, this experiment a little bit stalled with the civil strife and etc. So we have 2 types of analysis. First, we look at individuals from across 32 sub-Saharan African countries, and we want to see whether when they know how to find out who owns a piece of land in their communities, if they go to a government office, if this is associated with their desire or agreement to pay taxes. And we find a very strong results for this association. And the second, actually, we are wondering, okay, if people consent to pay tax more, does it lead to the higher tax collection? And it does. We have a panel data for 37 sub-Saharan African countries, and the share of taxes from individuals in the total tax, and cadastre, our own data on cadastre, both speak to when resource is formalized, people are more likely to consent to pay taxes, and there is higher collection by the state in terms of taxes. However, please, next slide. Even full cadastrification of land would not allow a median sub-Saharan country to address the needs for additional resources, 19% of GDP, to finance their sustainable development goals by 2030. So cadastrification of formalization of property rights is not a silver bullet, and tax states, and I think this is the idea of our panel, the tax states, they are underpinned by complex institutional frameworks. And part of this institutional framework in the context of sub-Saharan Africa is the role of the traditional authorities in the management of property rights. We unfortunately so far don't know much about this, and it hasn't entered the analysis of fiscal states so much. On this, I will finish. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Right on time. And so we move to the third presentation, which is by Santiago Tobón. Santiago is a professor of economics at the Universidad EAFIT in Medellin, Colombia, and a non-resident senior research fellow at UNU Wider. Santiago, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta. Can you hear me well? Okay. So what I'm going to tell you is the research ongoing with Patricia Justino, Martín Vanegas, and Juan Vargas. We're moving now from Africa to Latin America, and what we're focusing on is on identifying these institutional challenges and broadly the challenges that don't allow developing economies to actually reach the levels of revenue that other countries have. So to start, I think we have been talking about this. Like, we know taxes are important. We know that modern states are still no exception on this. This started, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago when this ability to collect taxes was actually what determined institutional capacity. Now it is still true, and it is especially true now in lower income economies where reliance on tax revenue is even, if we think of it broader and more deep than in other countries. Next slide, please. And you can, there. And so we're focusing on Colombia. Why in Colombia? Because sadly, it sort of serves as a nice laboratory to examine these questions. Colombia is a country where, and we're going to focus on violence and illicit activities as the main challenges to collect tax revenues. Why is Colombia important for this? First, it faced a 50-year internal conflict that I think there have been many discussions in this building about this conflict in the country. Second, it is also the main producer of cocaine. Roughly 66% of cocaine that's consumed in the world is produced in Colombia. And to produce cocaine, you need large coca crops that cover now almost 300,000 hectares across the country, which imply that a lot of criminal organizations need territorial control. And this speaks to the need, for instance, for an organized cadastre to actually collect taxes. Third, there are a lot of criminal and rebel organizations that often compete with the state and serve to some extent as a parastate, right? They collect some forms of taxes that often people interpret as extortion, but often not. And they often also provide semi-public goods, especially, for instance, public security or dispute resolution and adjudication. And finally, and most importantly, during the 80s and 90s, Colombia undertook an ambitious decentralization program that was triggered mainly through the 1991 Constitution to improve local fiscal capacity. So most of the tax revenues were going to the central state before the 80s. And with the constitution of the 91 and some reforms in the late 80s, 2 taxes were assigned to municipalities to be collected by them. And this implied a decentralization of fiscal capacity and also a decentralization of competencies. And so we're going to focus on 2 main taxes. The first one is what we call the trade and production tax, which is paid by legal businesses on the basis of their income resulting from sales. And the property tax, which is paid by both households and businesses, is based on property valuation, and it's based on the cadastre that we were talking before. So these 2 now constitute, if you move to the next slide, roughly 30% of total income for municipalities in Colombia. Colombia has roughly 1,200 municipalities, 1,100. About 30% of their income comes from these 2 taxes, and this is the source, the part of the budget that they can spend in whatever they want, right? So other part of the budget are transfers by the national government. These transfers are directed specifically to education, health, and some other lines in the budget. This 30% of the budget is the one where municipalities can decide how to invest, in what to invest, and so on and so forth. So we're going to examine descriptively 4 different challenges that relate to violence and illicit activities, and how these can affect local tax revenues by municipalities. What I'm going to show you is mostly descriptive, nothing causal. At the end, I'm going to tell you where we are working on to try to identify causal effects, right? So the first thing is early land conflict. So Colombia, I told you before, faced this 50-year conflict. Sort of the start of the conflict, or even before the start of the conflict, there were a lot of municipalities where settler families resisted these land seizures by entrepreneurs and people arriving to the agricultural border of the country during the period between 1901 and 1931. And if we look at, these figures show the evolution of the trade and production tax on the left, the property tax on the right, and both taxes at the bottom, the evolution across 2 types of municipalities. Those that we know were exposed to land conflict, which is the black line, and those that were not exposed to these land conflicts, which is the dotted line. And you can see broadly that there's a kind of divergence started in 96 and 2000, which are the years in which this property and trade and production taxes started to consolidate. On average, over the last 10 years, the difference is it's about 32% between these 2 types of municipalities. If you move forward, we're going to also analyze this period called La Violencia, the violence. So this was a period of extreme political violence, bipartisan political violence between the 1940s and the 1960s. And if we do the same exercise, if you move to the same slide, we see a similar pattern, a bit less pronounced. So the difference here is about 18% in taxes collected between municipalities affected by La Violencia and municipalities not affected by La Violencia over the last 10 years. If we move to the next slide, we can focus also on the peak of the modern armed conflict between the 90s, early 90s, and 2010, roughly, 2015. And we can split here municipalities on the basis of the rate of attacks by either insurgent or counter-insurgent groups during this period of violence. We see a similar pattern, again, albeit less intense or pronounced. Here we split the municipalities, in three groups. The black line are those expected to kind of high-intensity conflict. The dashed line, not exposed to conflict at all. And the dotted line, which is roughly in the middle, usually municipalities exposed to conflict at a low intensity, right? So we see a difference of roughly 6%. And lastly, we can look at the illicit coca economy, right? So these are municipalities affected by coca crops between 2000 and 2020. And we do the same exercise. We split them in 3 groups. The black line, those not affected or deeply affected by coca crops. The dotted line, municipalities affected by coca crops at a low intensity, and the dashed line, municipalities not exposed to these illicit economies of coca, and we can see a broader gap, right? Roughly 34%. Again, this is descriptive, and you can imagine that there's a lot of coincidence, right? Municipalities that were both affected by La Violencia, affected by early land conflicts, affected by coca crops, and so on and so forth. So to sum up, what we were seeing is roughly that violence and illicit activities, we can think of that as a sort of driver of comprehensive erosion of local fiscal capacity, the compound of all these. We're seeing that municipalities exposed to violence and illicit activities feature low tax revenues. And we can see that the most important predictors so far are early land conflicts and coca crops. But again, think about causality here. We're focusing on each of these problems one by one. We're starting off with exposure to coca crops. And what we're seeing is causal evidence on that the exposure of coca crops decreases local tax revenues of both types of taxes, but mainly of property taxes. And the key explanation for this is that the value of cadastre, the value of land, does not increase once coca starts to arrive, compared to other municipalities that are not exposed to coca, where the pattern is typically that the value of cadastre, the value of land, starts to rise, right? So we're trying to kind of pin down the mechanisms behind the causality of each of these, and that's pretty much where we are. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
We are on time. It's perfect. So now I'll pass the floor to Kunal, both for his introductory remarks post facto, I'm sorry, and the presentation. Kunal is the director of UNU Wider, while he's on leave from the University of Manchester. Kunal, the floor is yours.
So thanks, Martha. Thanks for chairing. So thanks to Santiago, Marina. I mean, you all came a long distance to get to this session, so appreciate that. So I think what I wanted to say is that this session is somewhat maybe an outlier, actually, in the discussion we have today, because what I wanted to do in this session is to sort of highlight that we talk about taxation and the FfD4 agenda. We need to think more broadly about governance institutions, including state building. So we can't just think of taxation in itself, in isolation, if we do not see it in the broader sense of how states are built in the developing country context. And that's an important point we want to make in this particular panel. So going back to the question of fiscal capacity and moving on, sorry, you can just put the other thing on. So we know that there is an issue that we have seen where we have low-income country tax revenue over GDP, middle-income country tax over GDP are pretty much stagnant now. They had increased in the last 10 years, but now there's very little increase. And there's very little catching up with the tax over GDP ratios of high-income countries. And if you think about this particular challenge, that domestic revenue mobilization that developing countries are facing, there is a lot here about understanding the broader governance systems and broader state systems that underlie taxation capacity. And it's interesting to see that in the outcome document that was circulated just before this particular this academic day, a lot of it is made about rule of law governance being important critical elements of fiscal states and of mobilizing revenue. That was good to see because that's exactly what we're going to speak to in this panel and the work we've been doing in UNU Wider across many different projects. So this particular panel is exactly why we wanted to make the point that while taxation needs to be, of course, we need to think about technical reforms and so on and so forth, we cannot also forget that there's a broader governance institutional structure behind taxation states. And I just want to highlight that the papers that you've been hearing from Amir, Marina, and Santiago and myself, I'm going to present my paper in a minute, are all part of this UNU Wider's program on domestic revenue mobilization, which is the last 5 years. So Marina's paper and my paper came out in the Journal of Institutional Economics. This is open access last year. Amir's paper is coming out in the book chapter in Oxford University Press book on savings. I think it'll be it's around the corner. Santiago just finished his paper for UNU Wider with Martin and Patricia, and that hopefully will also make its way to a journal or a book chapter very soon. So whatever we do in UNU Wider, we try and make sure we have a journal article or a book chapter, and we pretty much believe that a working paper by itself isn't really going to be enough to get your message across. So just want to mention that. And it's all available on our website because they're all open access. The next slide, just to sort of thinking about why did we choose the papers in this particular panel. or not only because they're excellent papers in themselves, but because they are part of a broader argument they're trying to make wider around governance institutions. So the social contract that Martin mentioned. How can countries emerging from conflict situations strengthen the social contract between the state and the citizen, and how do you build in social trust and cohesion? And of course, Colombia is a very good example of a country that's has gone through significant conflict, which has implications for domestic revenue mobilization. Taxation institutions, the point that Marina makes is very important because we often forget that taxation states need complementary institutions. For example, the pair that her presentation showed that you need to have also investment in property rights around land. If you do not have that, then you cannot expect to see an increase in property taxation. That's a really important point to make because we forget institutions are very important in explaining taxation. My paper that I'll present is about accountable institutions. How can institutions be accountable, and do accountable institutions, particularly political institutions, lead to greater taxation? Amit presented in his work on sovereign wealth funds an example of institutions that have been created to fund long-term capital, though, as Amir is arguing, that has not yet been the case with many of the SWFs we see in sub-Saharan Africa. And also, of course, SWFs can be also important in the climate-resilient transformations of African economies. So these papers are broadly across this whole cluster of work we're doing in UniWider across several projects, but all underlying the issues around governance. And that's just to make the point. Okay, so let me get to my presentation, and let me talk about accountable institutions. So if you think about taxation, and you think about how should accountability in political institutions really matter? And you might argue, well, that should not really matter. Why should accountability matter in political institutions to explain taxation? And as I said, of course, you see this particular graph, and you're absolutely surprised that you don't see catching up between low, middle, and high-income countries in tax over GDP. And then the question is, then, why is that the case? Is it linked in some way to political institutions that are either accountable or not accountable? So moving on to the next thing. So what we do in this work, this paper that is a part of a broader special issue we did with Marina's paper also in it on fiscal states in UniWider, our last project we did on this in the last phase of our domestic revenue mobilization program. Here we are trying to understand taxation and statehood, the state building. We're trying to see whether governance plays a role in building taxation states. I'm going to try and see whether there's some evidence that can link accountable political institutions to taxation. And the simple question we're going to try and answer is, do more accountable political institutions lead to greater domestic revenue mobilization, and does it lead to further strengthening the accountability of governments? In other words, is accountability therefore a two-way relationship with taxation? It helps taxation, and taxation helps accountability, because that then is a very good story because it leads to synergistic relationships between accountability and taxation states. So the argument here actually goes back in terms of economic and political science, that there is a strong argument that actually accountability should matter. Why? Because you can imagine that if you have a state which has accountability built into it, that the executive there are checks and balances on the executive in terms of what the executive can do, then you should expect to see the executive, the ruler, trying to monitor state finances in a better way, which would also obviously imply higher levels of taxation. Here, of course, when you think about the executive, you can also imagine what kind of checks and balances that there might be in a particular country. And the parliament can often play a very important role in overseeing the state budget, in making sure there is sort of a taxation, to make sure there's auditing going on with government spending, and also to veto new expenditures, which may be seen as costly. And all that it is doing, this kind of institutions, is building, exactly as Marta said, the social contract between the state and the citizen. The citizen is much more reassured that, okay, I see accountability in the political institutions. I'm pretty much feel confident that my taxes that I'm paying will not be misused in any kind of way. That's why accountability is important. So what do we do here in this paper is essentially then take it even more forward and say, okay, accountability matters, but does it matter not only in tax over GDP, does it matter in the composition of tax? And yes, it should also matter the composition of tax, because you can imagine that the more accountable political institutions are, the more likely that you, the citizen, will be willing to pay income taxes. And more likely will it be that the government will be able to essentially tax individuals which pay income taxes, and they can move away from indirect taxes, which are often seen as very regressive. So you should expect to see in countries which have accountable political institutions a compositional change from indirect taxes to direct taxes. And that is a very good thing, because we know the income taxes do lead to a very strong direct relationship between the state and the citizen. So that's what we should expect to see. And again, there's literature on this that can allow us to see that. So question is, do we see it in the data? So what we do here, and next slide, is that we use very long-run data, because we have to. Because you're looking at a process that goes over several years and maybe centuries. We're going to use data from the financial state, the government tax revenue data set, which is actually, I think, from Gothenburg, which is where Marina is. And we have 31 countries, not a lot of big sample, but we have 200 plus years of data. And that gives us a long-run perspective we want to use to tell this story. Along with that, we also use data from Gothenburg, that is a measure of political institutions and accountability, which is essentially the considered to the executive, which is a measure that's been used now quite a bit in political science and economics. So again, we have many years of data for this measure of accountability that we get from the political science literature. Okay, so what do we find? Well, first, we find, not surprisingly, that more accountable institutions are, both in terms of judicial institutions, the stronger courts are able to audit or monitor the state, or stronger parliaments are able to monitor the state, the rulers of the state. We seem to see a very strong positive correlation between accountability and taxation. That's pretty surprising. No matter whichever measure we use for accountability, we see this positive correlation. But then let's think about what happens to the composition of taxation. Next slide. And there we find, exactly as we thought we should, that there is a very strong, particularly positive correlation between accountable institutions and direct taxation, which is essentially, in this case, personal income taxation. So we see this very clearly. Not only is accountability important for tax over GDP shares increasing, we also see that it's really essential to do with to direct taxation. And when we look at the indirect tax scatter with executive constraints, we see a very different picture. We can now see that as accountability increases in a country, there's a move away from indirect to direct taxes, as we have hypothesized through the literature that comes from political science and economics. So we're seeing something here that's really interesting, and it's telling us that maybe there's a causal story here that we can try and understand, because we have such long-run data. Next slide. And again, just looking at country examples, and the many country examples that we have in our paper, you can see that that accountability measured by executive constraints and taxation moves together. When accountability increases in a particular country, then we see tax over GDP increase. When it falls, it also falls. This co-movement of these two variables is quite remarkable, because you're seeing countries here, in this case, Argentina and Venezuela, for over 200 years. So you can see these changes are happening over 200 years. And that's quite remarkable. And this kind of scatter that we see, this kind of correlation that we see over time for a particular country, really seems to be quite persistent for many countries that we have in the sample. So what do we do? Obviously, the next thing one wants to do is to see whether there's a causal relationship. I will not go through the causal story here. What we do is that we use the panel that we have, and we try to understand this using what is called co-integration tests, which are essentially a way to look at the long-run relationship between tax over GDP and direct and indirect tax over GDP, and consider the executive. And you can do that, and we find that clearly what we saw in the scatters are coming through in the econometrics, and we find that greater consider executive lead to higher tax over GDP, the stronger effect that we see in personal income taxes, and we also see that higher tax over GDP leads in the longer run to more accountable institutions. So this relationship between accountability and taxation is two-way. But what does it really mean? I think we can say that it means the following things. It means that, first of all, that we are in a situation where taxation of GDP is something that happens over time. Increase happens over time, because state building happens over time. So we expect to see in many of these countries that we are looking at where tax of GDP has not really increased in the last several decades, a longer process of state building that has to be aligned with taxation. states. That's the first point. The second point is that history matters. History matters because history tells us exactly how accountable political institutions evolve over time. But history matters not in a negative sense. The history is not destiny. Within the concept of history, you can actually do something within the constraints that you can try to increase the accountability of the institutions that you're working with. So history matters not in a negative sense. History matters that we need to understand how exactly it can shape the way, the possibility of change in a particular country. And finally, it's also pretty clear from what we have seen in this work, that accountability of institutions is absolutely crucial to creating taxation states. So it's important to understand the politics behind the fiscal contract, the state of citizens, and therefore need to understand that if you are thinking about trying to increase taxation, we need to think about also accountability for institutions. So SDG 16, which is essentially about governance and rule of law, and SDG 17 need to go together. Let me stop. Thanks.
Much, Kunal, and thanks very much for these 4 different presentations, which are somewhat complementary and which Kunal's post facto introduction brought them together. So we only have 15 minutes left for discussion, so I'll open the floor immediately. I think all the presentations have highlighted the importance of institutional frameworks and government systems in defining how effective the taxation system is. Institutions that not only need to be built, but that are different across countries, and so they have different impacts on the possibilities that the state has to tax. Let's open the floor for questions. And no questions? Okay. You want to introduce yourself briefly?
Thank you. Hector Ulloa from Skatteforsk, a research center on tax based in Norway. It's more a comment and a question, but something that goes to the presentations, this last one, but also the one maybe on Colombia and with the cadasters. I think it was very interesting that you mentioned how there is a willingness to pay taxes as you secure those property rights, but then we also know that there seems to be a tipping point, right? When that willingness fades away into this rational thinking of minimizing that tax bill. So something we have seen is also the risk of how these estimates of what's going on, there's an underestimation because of the opacity that we see right now in the financial systems in our world. So just a general comment on how do you think in all these different things, so how does it affect institutions, how would it affect these property rights, and maybe also when you have a shadow economy due to illegal activities, what can be the focus then for academia on fighting this opacity? Because what we have seen is that in recent years, through new collaborations, we know more about these things that are hidden. They're purposefully hidden. But now we have more information about offshore financial wealth, offshore real estate, all the mechanisms to hide these kind of things, which I think is also, just to put that into perspective, that a lot of these issues we raise sometimes, we don't really know the scope of how big this is, and there is a risk for underestimating these issues. And that is something that we have focused a little bit more in the past. So I wanted to maybe hear in these 3 very different topics, what do you think is the risk, or how does this issue with opacity affect this kind of research or these risks that you have mentioned in your research papers?
Okay, so please.
Director of the European Think Tanks Group, and I have a very specific question for Kunal. You mentioned that, and by the way, thank you very much for all the presentations, very, very interesting. You had a slide on how there is a shift from indirect to direct taxes, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, why it happened, how it happened, and if there are any best practices that could be extracted to feed the conversation towards SEBI. Thank you.
Babylonian rock. You get all this information from this. I just saw a rock. So where is the information from? How do you detect what this means? Yeah.
Okay, so let's take, Marina, do you want to go first with this very question?
Yeah,
and then...
I can. It's not me. It's obviously it's a mathematician from Australia. Actually, understood what is it quite recently. This tablet was in a museum displayed in Turkey for many years. Nobody understood what it was. It's a really recent thing, so that now they really can say this is a cadastre. It's a good question, and I can only speak about like this registration of land, right? I'll give you example. It's very important, the transparency and which leads to also accountability of governments, but also big players in the economy, right, to hide. So, for example, in the UK, which has a really peculiar cadastral history, about 20% of the land is still not registered. And you know which land is this? It's the land of big landowners like the royal family, who don't need the state to verify their exchange, because they are not going to be on a general market, right? Anytime soon, anyway, unless the monarchy goes bankrupt. And that's what this leads. If you can compare tax compliance between UK and Sweden, where you can open, yes, a computer and go and to see 99.9% of the land is in the tax, is in the very transparent system, right? So this leads to no leakage in the collection of tax in this of Sweden, right? So that is very important. How far we can extrapolate to other elements of the financial system, I'm not the best person to explain this.
Thanks very much, Marina. Let's keep on that question for a second, and then we'll move to the last question that was posed to Kunal on direct and indirect taxation.
I can take just a quick comment here. I think if we think about the context of Colombia, for instance, the shadow economy is very innovative. I think this is true pretty much everywhere. And one trade-off that we see from the institutional point of view is this trade-off of how much to decentralize, right? Because if you want a more sophisticated bureaucracy, you might be tempted to centralize more. But as you're more disconnected to what's actually going on in the ground, then you don't understand what's going on, right? And we see that in Colombia, in a country where a lot of money is laundered because of the narco trafficking in the city economy, and where, for instance, public policies around money laundering are based on international standards that prioritize some sectors of the economy over sometimes what we actually see that they're doing there. And just to give you an example, I recall this event where the National Planning Department were discussing new policies on money laundering. They invited experts to talk to us, and we were there. And they didn't prioritize some sectors that we thought were important because there's a lot of money laundering going on in Medellin and other cities, for instance, through the hotels and services industry, through restaurants, and so on and so forth. And when we asked them, we were a group, and we asked them, have you gone to Medellin? Medellin is probably the city where most of the money laundered in Colombia. And they were like, no, we haven't gone to Medellin. We were just focusing on the international standards. So I think this trade-off is very hard to understand and to actually pin down. It also depends on the context, but I think a lot goes into how we understand these things.
There's one thing that I think, just quickly, on the question you asked, is that when we present this paper and in different places, people say, are you talking about democracy when you talk about accountable institutions? No, we are not, because the accountability is not only unique to democracy. Accountability can also happen in the authoritarian system, but in a different kind of way, right? Say China may have accountability of a different kind, the Chinese Communist Party versus, say, a democracy. And so the measure that we have is actually very good because it captures both the authoritarian system, which also have accountability built into them in some kind of way, also versus related to democracy. Otherwise, the story seems to be democracy is a good thing for taxation, which is not what we're trying to say. So that's important to keep in mind. Coming back to the question that you asked, so this is the big challenge, right? If you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, and there's Amina sitting on here who's also working on this issue, that there essentially been a big reliance on VAT and other indirect taxes. Of course, trade taxes have been cut, so that's not so important, but VAT has become the main source of revenue after the trade tax has been cut. While personal income tax or even corporate income tax is a very small share still of of total tax revenues. Now, the question is then, of course, that, so what do we do about this? And of course, there are things you can do to think about how do you try to think of personal income tax increases, reforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that's important, of course. But maybe there's a bigger issue that's what we're trying to say. The bigger issue is that perhaps citizens to pay income taxes, whether corporations or individuals, they need to be reassured that the tax that they're paying that they can be held accountable, the state can be held accountable for those taxes. It's easier to levy VAT where accountability is not really that much compared to trying to impose income taxes where you need to have accountability. And so this particular relationship between accountability, and we of course do it in a particular way in the way we measure accountability, seems to be something very important. So if you believe in our long run story of countries have shifted away from indirect to direct taxes, there is an argument here that accountability has made a difference. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only thing that matters. That certainly is not the case, because accountability by itself may not give you the shift away from indirect taxes. You also need to do other things to make citizens pay higher taxes, compliance, and so on and so forth, of course, there. But there is a point that I think we need to keep in mind when we think about the importance of shifting away from VAT in particular, say in the Sub-Saharan African case, towards income taxes, which everybody would argue is a much better tax to have. It is progressive, and so on. And there may be an argument that accountable institutions, however way you think of developing those institutions, is going to be a big part of the story, right? And this may take, this is the other point, it'll take a long time. It's not going to happen tomorrow, because these things take a long time. Accountability in institutions is a long-term process, right? But this particular issue of accountability, or rather more representative institutions, should not be forgotten, because that's exactly what happened in many countries, especially in the Nordic world, where that became a big part of why there was a big increase in income taxes related to indirect taxes. So that's really the point. Yeah.
I don't know, now I'm probably understanding your question better. I think what you are trying to tell us, what is the importance of everybody contributing, right? Because if some players do not contribute, do not pay tax, right, through the, I don't know, offshore, so the tax morale or tax compliance falls, right? This is a classical example of collective action, right? So if you don't pay and you don't pay, what Margaret Levy is teaching us, why I should be the sucker who pays for two of you, right? So, and then of course people will start looking for opportunities not to pay as well. So that is extremely important, and that is the role of institution where it is. It's extremely important to be ever present as the Swedish state, right? And also accountable, right? Because that are two conditions which allows to maintain us this virtuous circles and not to slip into vicious circle, which is extremely dangerous when some groups will start either underpaying or taken, this is also a discourse, taken from the common pot without contributing. This is the discourse what is happening in the Nordic countries. Oh, all these immigrants, they are not contributing, they are only taken from the common pot. That is why I don't want to pay. And it's also the Swedish tax authority is thinking about this right now. But this is a collective action. I think it's extremely interesting.
Thank you. Less than 5 minutes left? 5? Okay, so there's time for 2 more questions. I also have 2, but I see there are some on the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Hazel Granger from ODI Global, Global Affairs think tank. thanks very much for it's very interesting to see the academic evidence on the connection between accountability and taxation, and clearly the institutions involved in those take a long time to develop, and that's something that will kind of happen over time. I was just wondering what the panel thinks about if there are any kind of clear recommendations for governments, particularly that they can focus on over the short to medium term, whether that is investing in digital public infrastructure or the kind of cadasters or tax registrations, or maybe the connection between tax revenues and spending through strengthening public finances or something else. So I'd be interested to hear what your specific recommendations might be.
If I can follow up onto that, specifically, oh, I'm sorry. It was just an addition to that, but go ahead.
Yes, sorry. My name is Mahongora Kabibwa from ITUC. Mine is on the sovereign funds. In terms of its governance, where do you see the people? In order to avoid, where do you see the people, the citizen, in order to avoid the issues of elections where governments go and use it for self-help purposes? How do you make it more democratic? And do you have any other possible example that are working from a different continent? Thank you.
On the same note, so you've made a very clear case on the high opportunity cost of some sovereign wealth funds and the ineffectiveness of some and the fact that they are difficult to implement through political cycles. So is it your recommendation? What's the conclusion? Should we just do away with the sovereign wealth funds, or are there recommendations you have to improve them? That's one. And for you, Kunal, and it's following up on the previous question too, when you were presenting, I was wondering, but of course, in order for governments to be accountable, they have to have the necessary institutional capacities, right? Which also affect whether they can effectively tax people or not. But if I understand what you were saying is that capacity is not enough. There have to be accountability mechanisms in place even if you have the capacity, right? So it's necessary and then something else. Is that what you're saying? Are there more questions, or should we give a chance for final answers because we have 3 minutes left? Two. Let's go ahead.
No, these are very good questions. So starting on the role of citizens and governance mechanisms, something that actually I think I might have taken it out from the slides to make it fit, but it's the whole governance of those funds and how that, has an implication on their purpose and their effectiveness. And obviously governance is key, and accountability as well. One thing that we found was if the funds start to have more than one objectives, it makes governance more difficult. It's more difficult to measure, to evaluate the impact, whether it's supposed to be for transformation, the transformation effect on the economy, or if it's on the pure return on investment in overseas asset and whatnot. But the role of citizens is key, and here the key point is on communication of the fund and the objectives that it's trying to achieve. And I think two particularly useful examples are from Malaysia and Norway. So, and it's interesting because they have different objectives too. So in Norway, it's mostly a kind of stabilization fund, the oil fund, right, which is over $1 trillion in asset capitalization. If you go on the website of the Norwegian oil fund, it's the same as what you mentioned on Sweden. You open the page, and it gives you like a second-by-second update of the capitalization of the fund, right? So you keep seeing the number increase. And the idea is like you see that money as basically being Norwegian people's money that is used, and the returns of which is about 46%, is used for different programs. And just for the anecdote, I used to have a Norwegian flatmate in undergraduate, And she used to say, to brag that actually she owned a piece of that very expensive building on Regent Street in London because this was owned by the old fund. But what it really shows is that there is that understanding that that money is invested on behalf of Norwegian people, and they knew, right, what is the purpose of the fund. And Malaysia is also another very interesting example because it's a sovereign development fund, right, investing both domestically and overseas. And the name of the fund is Khazana, which literally translates as the treasure, right, or the chest. And the whole point is that they had the concept of true value, which they had to do a lot of public communication with citizens to explain that the whole point of the investments was to actually create local value. And this investment was not just done, right, to just, increase the capitalization or just to favor companies, but the whole point was to create this kind of job. So the communication is particularly important. And when you don't communicate about the fund, this is when it becomes, a lot more difficult, or it becomes easier to misappropriate the use of the funds. And I think that you're...
Do away with the funds or recommendation?
Oh, yeah. So that's the typical answer of, it depends. It's the easy answer to those. But what we really show is if it's a country that really needs to diversify its productive structures, then just a stabilization fund is just not enough, right? It deals with the short-term issues, but not with the long-term ones. And our broader recommendation for most countries in Africa, but not all, because depending on their specific context, is really to prioritize sovereign development finance and specifically national development banks over sovereign development funds, because national development banks have credit scores and they can actually borrow money, right? Which is something that sovereign development funds cannot easily do. And so national development banks offer a viable route which has often been ignored. And that's because the standard policy advice, including by the IMF and the World Bank for decades, has been based on Milton Friedman's advice on the permanent income hypothesis, that it's better for countries not to spend that money for development, but just to invest it overseas and just spend the returns on those investments, which only works if you're Norway, Qatar, Kuwait, because your population size is so small in comparison to your resource rents that the 3% that you get is way enough, right, to spend domestically. There's no opportunity cost. But if for most African countries, actually the return investment is way too low, and that's why you need a better use of these funds. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kunal.
I think, Marlena, do you want to also respond?
I think you are better.
Okay, no, that's...
in the
no, I think very quickly,
matters.
because actually I'm going to get a very good response to Hazel about the accountability and institutional transparency being very important, right? And I think that's exactly the point, that I think that while we think about the broader FfD4 agenda, we should not forget that this broader also agenda on governance, institution, and which is transparency, accountability, all of these things go together, because otherwise we're not going to get to where we want to be, particularly around taxation, one could argue. Now, how exactly this might work in different country contexts, you can think of audit committees, in public finance, you can think of stronger checks on government expenditures, whatever it is that you can try and show the citizens that, look, we're making sure the taxes are getting spent properly, and that you can therefore pay more taxes because they will be well spent. So all of those things are pretty important in discussing, in our view, the FfD4 agenda, and that it should not go missing, which is why this particular panel was to make clear that those things should not go missing in the discussion going forward to next summer. Yeah, thanks.
I don't think we have time for closing remarks by the panelists or anything, no, because there's another event that started 3 minutes ago in this room, so we unfortunately have to finish. Yes. So we thank you very much to everyone, and especially the panelists, for the session, and we